did you practice journalism in the United States?
I was a professional journalist for 4 years in Atlanta with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
And what drew you to Atlanta?
I was very interested in going to Atlanta because it was a large newspaper and gave me the opportunity to really grow as a journalist.
What did Ecuador offer you that Atlanta didn't offer?
I had been working, and towards the end of my third year, I had grown a great interest in, and always had a great interest in national and international things, and I'd always had a great love for South America, dating back to high school times when I studied Spanish. I realized that I was coming to a point of change to where I was going to have to leave journalism in Atlanta and move to a different area in order to get a better job. And I decided it was an opportunity that I could get to go overseas that I might not ever have again. I lived there 18 years.
So why Ecuador in particular instead of another Spanish-speaking Latin American or South American country?
I'd always been fascinated with the Andean countries. When I was in fourth grade, my sister had an exchange student with her from Peru who was there, and he came and spoke at my elementary school. And from that point on, I was always fascinated with anything that had to do with the Andes Mountains and with the cultures of the peoples of Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia.
Could you describe some of the major differences between your normal life in the US and your normal life in Ecuador?
They were very significant. I moved to a large city, and so in moving to a large city, the city of Quito, there was a lot of things that were similar. There's a lot of cars, a lot of movement, a lot of buses, but the lifestyle was very different. The pace of life was much slower. Relationship was much more important to people than simply the idea of making money or time orientation. I mean, people try to be on time for things like work and for jobs and school, but for other things, people were not really worried about being on time. A social event that was announced for 7 o'clock never started until 8:30 or 9 o'clock in the evening. And people were never worried about so much about sleep or worrying about everything else. It was more a matter of relationship. People were much more important. It was a major change in food for me. The food in the mountains of the Andes is fairly bland, but it's based a lot of meat, a lot of rice all the time. Major meal is at lunch. We ate a lot of plantain products. They're cooked in different ways. We ate a lot of soup, which is the basis there. So the food was very different, but more importantly, it was just a very different feel to the culture, just in the way people thought and spoke and acted. And of course, I was doing everything in a different language, in Spanish.
Did you have trouble with the language barrier, or were you basically fluent before you left?
I always say I had just enough Spanish before I got to Ecuador to get myself into trouble. So I moved. I deliberately got the opportunity and moved into at the home of an Ecuadorian family who spoke very little English at all, and therefore I was immersed into the language, which is really what I wanted. And so in the process, what I did not realize is I was also being immersed into a lot of the culture as well. And so very quickly I began to pick up things. I had enough basis to be able to communicate very basically, but within a few months I was becoming very fluent because all I did was eat, drink, and sleep Spanish.
Tell me about the differences between American journalism and Ecuadorian journalism.
American journalism is fairly straightforward. We're aware of the fact that there's opinion that is given in editorial pages and opinion pages, but the journalism in the United States, we try to separate out opinion and say this is news and this doesn't have opinion, although it's not necessarily true. We know that opinion seeps into, especially in the newscast on television, things like that. but not as much. We at least try to. In Latin America, especially in Ecuador, the journalism was somewhat dispassionate, but very much people shared opinions there. I had actually moved down and had lived in the coastal city of Guayaquil. And you want to talk about change. From Quito to Guayaquil was like moving from Birmingham, Alabama to New York City. It was radically different. The pace in Guayaquil was much faster. People were, it was interesting. The people in Quito were very Southern in their culture and their style. They were very polite to your face, everything was nice, and as soon as you walked out of the room, they talked about you behind your back. And people in Guayaquil were very direct. They told you what they thought, but they were very sincere. And if you had friends in Guayaquil, they were friends for life. And they were very sincere, and you had no problem. They would give you the shirt off their back. People in Quito were much less generous. They were not, if you needed something, they were very hesitant to give it. It was again, sort of a mountain culture versus a coastal culture, which I think is typical around the world. And I found that I loved Guayaquil even more than Quito.
So why come back at all?
I would have been happy to stay in Ecuador the rest of my life, even though I loved Charlotte. I'm a native Charlottean. I love this area. But I realized that I realized that it was time to come back. We had terrible reverse culture shock coming back here because we were so used to life that way. And in fact, I sometimes am not quite sure I have totally ever adjusted back to living in the United States, because in so many ways I'm still very Latino and things the way I do and the way I think.
What are some things that coming back from Ecuador, you see in the United States that you wish were different or more Ecuadorian?
Number one, relationship. People don't have time for each other anymore. They say they do, but they really don't. And it's very hard the idea of just sitting down with people and having a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or having a meal with people. You have to schedule things in advance. It's terrible. The people are just so busy and so on the run, and everyone is constantly that way, and it's an accepted part of culture here. I don't miss some of the tension of always worried about whether my water is clean or whether what's happening, or like the time when I lived in Quito, where 6 months we had 12-hour rotating power outages due to a problem there. And so literally 12 hours on, 12 hours off. But you adjusted your life to it. People here complain if the lights flicker for a minute or even for 15 seconds, and I'm just happy that we have power at all. So, you learn to be grateful for a lot of things that we take for granted here in the United States.
Would you ever move back?
I think I would move to another country. I'm not sure I would move back to Ecuador. I would go visit. What I've learned is there was a famous writer named Thomas Wolfe from North Carolina. He was from Asheville, and he moved to New York, and he wrote a book called You Can't Go Home Again. Or he wrote a book actually, Look Homeward Angel, and then actually another one after that. But his phrase was, you can't go home again. And basically, as he returned to visit his family or try to move back to Asheville, he found that the people in Asheville had changed since he left, and he had changed in New York. And he realized that culturally, that's what happens, is that both places continue to move on. We always think of culture as being very static, being something that's just the same, but all cultures change. And so just like the city and the people changed here in Charlotte, the people and everything has changed in Ecuador in so many ways. And so I can't go back to what was. I could go back and see what is, and I think I could possibly adjust to it. But at this point, I think I would actually be more interested in going to a different challenge.